And we'll be off and running. All right. How's everyone doing this week? Enjoying our wonderfully chilly, breezy Florida weather? Yes, I know. It's real suffering down here. I can tell. Okay.
We can feel like it's like.
Oh, actually, you're right. Someone turned off the system there, and it's going to get a little stuffy if we don't put that on.
This is our food spell is coming.
Exactly. Well, it's windy outside, but it's not windy in here. If we had opening windows, we could just, let the wind come through. But everything's sealed up tight to keep the air conditioning in. All right. So we are moving into the law giving. After all, we got out of Egypt, and we got done with all those miracles, the last weeks of Bishalach, of crossing the sea, and all of that goodness. And now it's time to realize that God didn't just set us free to be free. He set us free so we could be free to follow what God is going to tell us to do. And we are going to get a long series of legislation. And most famously, we're going to be looking at something rather well known in this section of the Torah. Please, what parasha are we in? Yitro. What's the most famous part of Yitro? Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments. And we're not going to be looking at them today. We looked at the 10 Commandments last year. We're going to be looking at another part.
Let me ask you a question. Last week we did the Song of the Sea.
Correct.
And regardless of which section of the triennial we are, we do that.
Yes.
How come we don't do the 10 Commandments?
We are doing them.
I mean, every year.
There's actually two versions of the triennial. One that does have it every year, and one that doesn't. So it's not a given depending upon which system of the triennial you're using, but it is possible to do all of them. The difficulty, of course, is the length of the reading, which gets quite long. And I will repeat again for the official record. He says, pointing to the camera. Just because we don't read out loud publicly the entire Torah reading on Shabbat does not mean that we as individuals are absolved from our personal obligation to read the entire Torah portion every week. So we don't do it necessarily on Shabbat, but you should be reading it between Shabbat afternoon and Shabbat on your own and get through the entire Torah portion at least once, and there's some other discussions about doing it twice, plus translation and all of that, but we're not going to get into that. But you should at least get it through it once. If you're not sure what the Torah portion is, well, I'm pretty sure everybody in this room is, but for those who are playing at home, you can always check out the Facebook page. We give a weekly update right after Shabbat's over, so that it tells you what the next reading is. You can do it in Hebrew, you can do it in English. Read your Torah on your own, and come to services and learn a little bit more. Does that give some of an answer?
Yes.
Okay. But we're not going to be doing the 10 Commandments today either. So we're not skipping it, but we only can focus on so much at a time.
Because you said that.
Yes, but we can only focus on so much each week. And in this week, we're actually going to focus on the beginning section of Parashat Yitro. And why is it called Parashat Yitro? What happens at the beginning?
Moses' father-in-law comes.
Moses' father-in-law, Yitro, also known as Jethro, not just one of the Beverly Hillbillies, shows up. And it is for him that the entire parasha is named, for his arrival. So we're going to start with Yitro, and we're going to...
We name a parasha for a non-Jew? Oh.
Well, that's a good question.
Excellent question.
Although you may be putting the emphasis on the wrong part of that question. But we'll get to that. Okay? So let's just make sure that we understand generally who was Yitro, who was Jethro? The first organizational consultant, spoken like a man in the field. So as we're going to see, he has some advice for Moses on how to handle his job. But Jethro was Zipporah's father, and Zipporah was the woman who was married to Moses. We got that? So that's why we say that Jethro was Moses' father-in-law. But as we're going to see, that wasn't his only job. As busy of a job that may be, that wasn't the only thing he did in life. All right, so we're going to start with the beginning of Yitro. We're on page 432, if you're looking in the Eitz Chaim. We are on chapter 18, verse 1, if you are using any other edition of the Tanakh. Okay?
Judy.
Good. English reader to help me along here. Don't all volunteer at once. Please.
Jethro, priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out from Egypt. So Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after she had been sent home, and her 2 sons, of whom one was named Gershom, that is to say, I have been a stranger in a foreign land, and the other was named Eliezer, meaning, the God of my father was my help, and he delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought Moses' sons and wife to him in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the mountain of God. He sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons. Moses went out to meet his father-in-law. He bowed low and kissed him. Each asked after the other's welfare, and they went into the tent completely ignoring Zipporah.
Thank you for doing the little read-through. we used to call that in rabbinic school a read-through Rashi, where you just insert the Rashi translation, commentary right into the translation. Okay, so we'll come back to that question tangentially, but we have Jethro here being described as, of course, the we're going to abbreviate the FNL of Moses, the father-in-law of Moses, and what's his other title?
Midian priest.
Priest of Midian. Priest of Midian? Wait, he's a Cohen? Look at the Hebrew. He's a Cohen. He's a Cohen. It says Cohen. Cohen is not a proper name in biblical Hebrew. We may treat it like such now because of the Kohanim that are descended from Aaron that have used that as a proper name. But just as the name Smith in English is now considered more of a name than a job, so too the word Cohen is now considered more of a name than a job. Certainly some people seem to treat it that way. But the word Cohen is being used here to describe Yitro as being a priest of Midian.
As if I said a priest in the Catholic Church. The word priest being the job, and you can use it for different people, it doesn't necessarily mean a Jew, is what you're saying.
Correct. Although I'm going to take a little back off on the phrase a priest of the Catholic Church, because does this say that he is a priest of a particular god?
Just a place.
Of a place. Midian is a place. It's not actually a deity. Now, we would probably assume, were we living many millennia ago, that if he was a priest of a place, that he served that place's god. The general assumption of the ancient world was that different parts of the world had gods that went along with them. And so if you were a priest of the area, that was as good as saying you were a priest of that area's god. The same way that if you were to describe someone in ancient Israel as being a priest of Israel, you would probably believe that they were serving Hashem. You wouldn't think that they were a priest of some other god while in Israel, because our God, is the default God of Israel. Make sense? So what was he? Does that mean he was an idolater? Does that mean he wasn't Jewish? What do we do with this? What do we do with this? Well, let's see how he behaves in the next paragraph, and maybe that'll give us a few more clues. Malka, before...
This is current. Don't the Druze worship Jethro as their spiritual leader?
They do include him among their ancestral chain. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Okay. So he hasn't been forgotten by everyone.
No.
All right. Go ahead and keep reading the next paragraph. Let's see what he says and what he does, and maybe that'll give us some more clues.
Moses then recounted to his father-in-law everything that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardships that had befallen them on the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced over all the kindness that the Lord had shown Israel when he delivered them from the Egyptians. Blessed be the Lord, Jethro said, who delivered you from the Egyptians and from Pharaoh, and who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods. Yes, by the result of their very schemes against the people. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to partake of the meal before God with Moses' father-in-law.
Okay, well, that cleared it up, right?
Yeah.
Made it a little more complicated here. Okay, so what do we have Jethro saying or doing that might give us clues one way or the other to his religious identity?
Well, he acknowledges that there are other gods.
Okay, so he says, you know, that God, how does it say our God, is, we're going to use the word better, you could use the word greater, better than others. Okay, does that mean that he is Jewish or non-Jewish? If he's acknowledging that God is better than other gods, not Jewish, because it seems to be implying that there are other gods, and you know that even if he is what's officially called a hentheist, which is somebody that believes in multiple gods but prizes one as being greater than all, it still seems counter to Judaism, which says there ain't no other gods. Isn't that what we say? Who was here last week and read through the Song of the Sea? Who comes to services? Who davens? Right? Mi chamocha ba'elim. Who is like you, God, among the other gods? So we, what's that?
Why are we saying?
So we at the Song of Sea, and we daily, if you daven daily, or at least when you come to services, hear that song over and over again that God is greater than all the other gods.
But even if you don't hear that, one of the 10 Commandments is, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." Even God is acknowledging if there are others, just don't put them before me.
I wouldn't go quite that far.
Okay.
I wouldn't go quite that far in interpretation. But we should at least be open to the possibility that Judaism seems to say you can talk as though there were other gods while pointing out their nothingness. So you can talk about things that are called gods by other nations, by other peoples, while putting them down, while pointing out that they are not gods. So we allow that from Jewish text. Why not allow that from Jethro? There's nothing like anything that's called a god that is like your God, now that I've seen what God has done. That would not be a statement of someone who believes in other gods. That would be a statement of someone who might have used to have believed in other gods, but now realizes that they ain't nothing compared to the God. Sort of ultimate proof. Is that possible? Okay, so we can't say one way or the other just on this sentence, though, whether he is or isn't Jewish, or whether he is or isn't an idolater.
I was interested in verse 12, where Yitro is bringing a burnt offering. And my first inclination was to say, well, if he's making a sacrifice to a particular god, it must be that he accepts this particular god. But
after all, you wouldn't offer a sacrifice to a god that you didn't believe in.
Maybe not.
Maybe.
Maybe not.
Indeed.
I was just also, then my mind is going forward, and I'm saying, wait a minute, Yitro is not the first convert, Ruth is. Why is it? Because she says, I'm not you, but your people are my people, may your God be my God.
And wherever you go, I will go.
And wherever you go, I will go. I think what makes this not necessarily conversion is that...
And I should point out for the benefit of everyone else that in the ancient world, when we still had a temple in Jerusalem, one of the obligations for someone who wanted to convert, in addition to mikvah and if it was a man, circumcision, was to bring a sacrifice. And in fact, that is still an incumbent implicit obligation of anybody who converts. It's just one they can't actually perform because there isn't the temple to actually do it. But we still let people convert anyway, even though they can't do that sacrifice. So you might be tempted to read this sacrifice, which I believe is sort of what you're hinting at, as being part of that conversion process, or at least part of acknowledging God as God.
Necessary but not sufficient.
But it's not a slam dunk, indeed, because we have other examples of other characters biblically, as well as we know from the classical historical period, that were not Jewish, that also offered sacrifices to God. You know, famously, the Roman government would send sacrifices to Jerusalem to be offered on their behalf, and we offered them. Doesn't mean the Romans were all gung-ho about God. Doesn't mean the Romans wanted to become Jewish, fortunately. But it means it's not a slam dunk. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't.
As it was pointed out, the fact that a parasha is named after him, that says a lot.
Well, yes and no. Don't you love those answers? So, absolutely, giving him the honor of having a parasha named after him seems very telling. On the other hand, if you look at the naming conventions for parshiot, they usually pick the first distinctive word to use as the name. And the fact that this one happens to be his name might be tempting to interpret that way, but then what do we do about, like, you know, Vayeshev, and he dwelled? Does that mean that dwelling is somehow, we're going to have to drosh that too? We have to come up with an explanation? I mean, we have a parasha named Korach. That doesn't necessarily mean we support Korach and his rebellious crew. So it's hard to use that as conclusive evidence. But hopefully we're getting ourselves into a good state of confusion. As everybody knows, I like confusion, and that's when we're ready to actually learn.
Now, I'm actually very impressed with Yitro, because he recognizes the miracles that God did.
Mhm.
Now, our people are sitting there and they're already mad. They don't remember any of this. They just don't have food that's interesting to them. So he's recognizing something that God was trying to show everybody, but apparently he's the only one who got it, him and Moses.
Well, yes, him and Moses are sharing a moment, which is
Yes.
very touching. And yes, indeed, Zipporah doesn't seem to be present. But on the other hand, he seems to be sharing the moment. But if we say he doesn't become Jewish from it, isn't that just the same as all of the Israelites who said, yes, those were great miracles, we sang a nice song, now where's the food? You know, they're not exactly satisfied with just the miracles, so maybe he's not just satisfied with the miracles. He's happy to say, way to go, God, that's pretty impressive stuff.
And now let me make a sacrifice and let's eat.
I'll make a sacrifice to you, let's eat. But that doesn't mean I want to join the tribe. Perhaps it's not indicating that. Perhaps there's still a sense of ambivalence in his relationship. Well, let's take a look at what the commentators say. Zipporah was out cooking. Well, if it was a sacrifice, it wasn't quite ready yet. And
It's a little rare.
all right, so let's take a look at whether or not our tradition believes that Yitro was or was not an idolater, or was not a Jew. And I should point out those are two very, very different questions, right? What does it take to be not an idolater? That's not a trick question. If you want to be classified as not an idolater,
You can't worship idols.
thank you.
God.
Exactly. If you don't want to be called an idolater, don't worship idols. So let's do it this way, all right? We got idol folk, right? And then we've got, ideally, Jews. Unfortunately, during different parts of history, these have overlapped, but let's talk about what Jewish law says, is that a Jew is categorically not meant to be worshiping idols. And then we have something like this, where you have, then you have, need to work on my Venn diagrams. Then you have something like this, which are others. And in Jewish tradition, they're called various things. They might be called, Yirei Hashem, the God-fearers. And they also be called B'nai Noach, the children of Noah, meaning those who follow the Jewish idea of what non-Jews should be doing, but who have not actually adopted Judaism for themselves. They're not idol worshippers, because they're not worshiping idols. On the other hand, they're not Jews because they haven't formally converted. And the question is Yitro there? Or is Yitro there? Or did Yitro start here and go there? Or did Yitro start here, go there, and then go there? Or did he start here, go there, and stop? It's confusing to figure out where he is. And we'll talk about why this is more important as we go along, but let's just try and deal with him in the first place. Okay? Good? Excellent. So let's start with the Mechilta, one of the earliest threads of Midrashic interpretation. So who'd like to help us on a little reading? All right, thanks.
Rabbi Eliezer said, "The Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, I am the one who spoke and brought the world into existence. I am the one who brings close, not who pushes away. I brought Yitro close and I did not push him away. So you also, when a person comes to you to convert and comes for the sake of heaven, you should bring him close and not push him away."
Okay. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, what was Yitro's status? Convert. A convert. That,
Or coming to
well, in the process of converting, perhaps, depending upon where in the story we get this, but somebody who is definitely being used as a parallel to future converts that Moses is going to encounter. And that just as God brought Yitro close without rebuffing him, so too should Moses allow people to draw closer to God, to become Jewish without a rebuff. Make sense on the reading? Any questions, problems? Maybe? Okay. We'll come back to this idea. It's also was quoted very famously by Rabbi Uziel, who was the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel from 1939 until 1953. How things have changed, indeed. We're going to actually get another quote by him on the back, which will say even more about how things have changed. Okay, so one of the other techniques for trying to figure out what Yitro was is looking at what his descendants were. I speak English. The Kenites, who are usually attributed in the Bible as being the descendants of Moses' father-in-law. I should also point out that Yitro is known to have 7 names throughout the Bible, so tracking down exactly who's who can be a little tricky, but historically they generally were thought to be the descendants of Moses' father-in-law. They're mentioned in Shoftim. In fact, they were mentioned in the section there for chapter 4 in the Haftarah that we read this last week in Parashat Beshalach. The Haftarah is taken from the story of Deborah, and brave Yael, who killed the Canaanite general Sisera, she was a Canaanite. Not Canaanite, a Canaanite. So she was descended, according to the text, from Moses' father-in-law's clan. And she lived in the area that was becoming Israel. Does that make them Israelites or non-Israelites? Exactly. Well, they don't exactly seem to be full-fledged Israelites because they're not getting the apportionment of the land. They're not there in line for the dividing of the land. They don't seem to be incumbent upon the mitzvot. And certainly Sisera, when he ran into their camp to find refuge from the Israelites who were attacking him, thought he might find refuge from the Israelites that were attacking him. So he at least seems to see this group as a separate group of people, a separate tribal identity.
Would they be like the Arab group?
Well, we're not sure. And that's why the commentators struggle, because if Yitro was the founder of this clan, then that might put them here.
Right before, timing.
Exactly. That he accepted God but didn't accept Torah, and therefore they are sort of on the periphery of Judaism. They're not idolaters, but they're not exactly one of us either. And after a few generations, we could see how there would just be sort of a distant relationship between the Israelites and them. Maybe. Maybe. All right, let's try another tack. All right, keep going. We're on the 3rd paragraph now.
Now the chief of Midian had,
Ul Cohen Midian.
the most prominent among them. He had abandoned idolatry, so they banned him from living with them. From Exodus Rabbah 132, and drove them the daughters away because of the ban.
Okay, so Rashi, way back in the beginning of the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, deals with this question of who is Yitro. And when Yitro was first introduced as being this Cohen of Midian, what is Rashi's explanation of that title? Midian? He's a chief. He's prominent. So he takes the word Cohen and secularizes it. strips out the religion. And in the process also decides to give Yitro a little boost by claiming that he had been an idol worshiper when he was in Midian. After all, everyone else was. But he rejected idol worship, moving himself into the category of others. And in the process of doing so, his own people pushed him out. Which would be one reason why he might be in the middle of the Sinai desert rather than in the better parts of Midian's territory. Because otherwise, what's he doing out there? He's the high priest of Midian, he's the priest of Midian, he's the prominent guy, but he's living in the middle of nowhere? You know,
Well, he came to bring his daughter and Moses' sons to him.
in the first meeting, when Moses is fleeing Egypt as a young man. This quote is taken from the very beginning of the book of Exodus.
Sorry.
Yes, we would expect, yes, his return for exactly that reason, but his first meeting,
Okay.
why was he out there in the Sinai wilderness? Now, there are some biblical scholars that try to say that the first meeting between Moses and Zipporah and Yitro wasn't in the Sinai wilderness, but was in the more prominent areas of the Midian area. But, you know, it's a bit of a stretch. This is an answer that would explain why a prominent man wasn't living in the prominent place.
Did he know Moses before the daughter know Moses?
No. He did not know Moses, and in fact, when Moses shows up and shoos away the people that are hassling his daughters, we get an explanation by Rashi that the reason the people were hassling Jethro's daughters was because he had been essentially excommunicated from the idolatrous religion of Midian. So the daughters were being treated badly because their father had stopped being an idolater, and therefore it was only natural that Moses would come to their aid. And, you know, it's one non-idolater helping out another. Make sense? Okay. We begin to see maybe one of the reasons why Jethro's status becomes a little bit more important, of why we need to figure out where he is on this spectrum of theology. Not yet? Okay, keep thinking. Let's keep going. Mary, I want you to keep plowing through.
After Yitro converted to Judaism, he was called Rabbi, as seen in Judges 4:11. It is the way of all converts to call themselves a different name when they become Jews.
All right, so what's Ramban's explanation for how we know that Jethro converted? Because we stop calling him Jethro. And we start calling him something else. Just like everybody else that converts, you know, Yitro must have adopted a new name in order to reflect his new status as a Jew. Plausible? Slam dunk? No. Not a slam dunk, because there are lots of other explanations for why all the names for Jethro, but it's plausible.
Does the name Kobach have any significance or anything to tell us about
Not
that issue?
definitively, no. I mean, it certainly could be, but it's not a slam dunk. All right, let's try the next explanation.
Cohen in biblical Hebrew can refer to one who serves any god, false or true. However, Yitro was a priest of the true God.
All right, so even Ezra takes it one step further. He says, yes, a Cohen can be a god of any, a priest of any god. That's just a standard job description term, generic and non-prejudiced, good or bad in biblical Hebrew. But don't get the wrong idea. Yitro was, according to Ibn Ezra, categorically a servant of God, the one true God. So, well, why does he say that? Because he doesn't want to take the tact of Rashi of secularizing the term Cohen, because the word Cohen does seem consistently to refer to a religious occupation. But then he's left with the problem of Yitro being a religious devotee, a higher up devotee of a false god. So in order to save Yitro, we have to either make the title Cohen be a secular title, or make the title Cohen still be religious, but for the right religion. Now that doesn't mean that he becomes a Cohen like one of the sons of Aaron's Cohen. That means that he worshipped God and tried to lead others in the worship of God. Even if it wasn't being done in a Torah way, it was being done in an appropriate non-Israelite, but still worshiping of God way. That make sense? We all convinced?
Does that name Cohen that was given to these people who were not descendants of Aaron, has that continued, John?
It has not. It has not. So we preserve the term Cohen, the title Cohen, as a family name within Judaism because we take such pains to call people by a name that includes the title HaKohen. But if we hadn't, then it would have been gone.
So if that name Cohen is given to someone because they believe in one God, that it does not apply to their children.
Not automatically in other faiths, no. All right, any other questions so far? We're still good and confused? We're not sure what to make of him?
It may not seem important, but what language are they communicating? Medium or
Well, our record of their communication is in Hebrew. Despite many people's thinking, people in the ancient world would have most likely typically been polyglots. That is to say, they would have been able to speak more than one language. Because languages were very localized, very regional, and there was a lot of people trading back and forth. So we may not know exactly what language they were speaking in, but we can be sure that Hebrew was probably known by Moses and by Yitro, and Moses probably knew Midian as well as Yitro did. So they could have been talking in either language. But our record's in Hebrew. Okay. Why are they so desperate to save Yitro and to make sure that we don't? Why not just say he was an idol worshiper? Okay, and then lo and behold, later on here, he goes, wow, your God's really cool. Let me give a sacrifice to him too. Why not just make him an idol worshiper, make him acknowledge God as being great, but leave him an idol worshiper and be done with it? Why are we trying to rescue him theologically?
Because Moshe married his daughter.
Yeah, exactly.
And therefore, Yitro must have had some influence over the wife to convert her, so Zipporah could be true.
How many times have we read in this the few verses we've had of chapter 18, father-in-law, 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 father-in-law. His wife came from this guy. How did Moses marry Zipporah? What was her status? She wasn't an Israelite, we know that, because if she was an Israelite, she would have been living in Egypt. So much of the effort going into rescue Yitro is actually a way of trying to rescue Zipporah, of trying to make sure that her status is not called into doubt.
But aren't there a lot of examples in Torah of in-laws that aren't good people, but their children are very good people?
Lavan being the most prominent.
Right. So
However,
what's
they
the
don't
problem?
get the title priest. The daughter of a priest. We know what the daughters of the Kohanim within Israel are expected to do, which is a much higher level of what we'll call strict adherence or piety than the daughters of non-Kohanim within Israel. There are separate laws, for example, for philandering, if you're the daughter of a Cohen than if you're not. So I think the presumption was that the daughter of an idolatrous priest would have been knee-deep, if not deeper, in the idolatrous practices of their country. And to imagine that such a person would become the wife of Moses.
Although Abraham was able to come from that environment and push all the idols away.
Indeed, but God spoke to Abraham. We don't have any statement about God speaking to either Zipporah or Jethro. So we have to find a way to save them. I think is the psychological impetus that's going on here.
When Moses ran away from Egypt to Midian
Yes.
and met Zipporah, he was a young guy then.
Well, he was 40 years old, but thank you.
He was that old when he struck the Egyptians
Yes.
and ran away?
Yes. He lived his lives in thirds. He had 40 years in Egypt, 40 years married to Zipporah as a shepherd, and 40 years leading of the people. And died at 120.
Okay.
So he had 3 careers in life.
You sure did.
Yeah, prince, shepherd, and national leader.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a lot to put into one life. That's why he needed 120 years for it. But where I thought you were going with that was when he ran away from Egypt, did he know he should be looking for a non-idolatrous woman to marry.
No, he was just mad at the injustice
And afraid for his own life.
and reacted,
Right.
and then ran for his life.
And so the commentators also argue about how much Moses knew of his Judaism, of his Israelite heritage when he left Egypt. But that's an argument for another class.
And
Oh.
why Moses was in Egypt, what he worshipped.
Exactly. What was he worshiping as he grew up? For 40 years he grew up in the palace. You think that every time they had Pharaoh walk by and he was, a relative of this guy, that he didn't perform the rituals required to acknowledge this man as God? That
Sure.
he didn't go to the temples? He didn't participate? I think that would have looked a little funny. Carol, did you want to?
I was going to comment that there's a similar situation with Joseph in
Mhm.
Egypt is given the daughter of a priest.
Absolutely. Anat, which becomes the daughter, the wife of Joseph, is also said to be the daughter of an Egyptian priest. So it's
And her name is Anna.
yeah. So it's not so clear what's going on here. All right, let's continue with a few more commentaries, and then we'll see about applying this. All right, give Marion a break. Someone else want to read? I'd like to spread the wealth around, but no one else is jumping on it. So why don't you keep going?
Yitro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard. What had he heard that made him come and convert?
Okay, pause there. So what we have here is a different account of Jethro's status. They're saying, yes, he was non-Jewish. The leave-in for a side here, whether or not he was or was not an idol worshiper, but he was definitely not Jewish until this parasha, when he shows up. And he gives that blessing to God and offers up that sacrifice. And that something changed his mind. And now they're going to argue about what it was.
Rabbi Joshua says, he heard about the war of Amalek and came as is written in the immediately prior passage.
Right before, the very end of Bishalach, as Matthew Gottfried read this last Shabbat, is the story of Amalek, attacking us and us fighting back. So Rabbi Joshua says, well, if we just finished talking about Amalek, and in the very next sentence Jethro shows up, it must have been he was so impressed with the fight against Amalek and our victory there, that's why he showed up and decided to become Jewish. He went, wow, if their God can fight back against Amalek like that, sign me up. So it's the juxtaposition of the two parshiot is what gives him the hook for making this interpretation.
Rabbi Eleazar Hamodai, he heard about the giving of the Torah and therefore came along. When the Holy One, blessed be he, revealed the Torah to Israel, the sound of the matter echoed from one end of the earth to the other, and all the kings of the world shook in their palaces.
So when God gives Torah at Mount Sinai, which hasn't happened yet, Jethro, along with everyone else in the world, heard it. The sound of the trumpets, the shattering of the sky, all the noise and things that went along with it. And he went, whoa, yeah, I want to be on that team. That's the most impressive fireworks display ever done at a Super Bowl. I want to be on that team. Plausible?
But it hasn't happened yet.
But it hasn't happened yet. Okay, well, there is a principle in Midrashic thinking that just because something hasn't happened doesn't mean it hasn't happened. That is to say, the order in which things are written down in the Torah is not always indicative of the strict chronological order in which they happen. And one of the clues that may be the case is that the people, that as far as we know, the Mishkan hasn't been built yet, right? Because we haven't got the Torah yet, we haven't got the instructions for the Mishkan, so therefore there's no altar that's been constructed yet, and therefore what's he offering his sacrifice on? And the answer is, no, this happened after the Torah was given, after the Mishkan was built, and that's when he showed up. And that's why there was a place for him to make a sacrifice. And the alternative explanation, of course, is that no, they had already had temporary altars, they just hadn't made the real altar that was going to be the biggie, the important one.
Many sacrifices have been made.
Exactly, so that's why it still goes back and forth about whether this happened where it looks like it's happening or whether it's a event that is written out of order in order to teach something else. But we go back up to Rabbi Eliezer's statement at the very top of the page, where it says that you also, when a person comes to you to convert and comes for the sake of heaven, you should bring them close. Is this L'Shem Shamayim? That they came for the sake of heaven? He came after he heard about the war of Amalek. He came after the giving of the Torah. Are these being described as wholehearted, pure reasons for attaching oneself to Judaism? Or is it, hey, look at what their God is doing. I like that. I want me a piece of that. Or, wow, did you see that Torah being given? Or did you hear that Torah being given? All the kings in all their palaces all around the world are shaking. They're all afraid. Maybe I should be on the winning team. That's generally not exactly considered to be for the sake of heaven. If an Israelite army marches into an area and conquers it, and the people say, well, tell you what, how about if we convert? Okay, put down the spears. Do we generally consider that a conversion for the sake of heaven? If someone says, I hear the Jews are really, really rich, and I could use some help in my business, would you mind if I converted? Because I hear that'll open up some doors for me.
It's not the same thing, sis.
Not the same thing? Because?
Becoming a convert for expedience sake, in my opinion, is different than becoming a convert because you see that their way may be the better way.
Because you've been impressed by their victory in battle? Because you're afraid that they may be victorious more and more and that you might be on the wrong side of that fight? Is that expediency, or is that being impressed by their God and what's happening on their behalf?
They were watching the arms going up and down at God's and God responding. That's revelatory.
It's absolutely revelatory. But are you allowed to convert because you have been convinced it's in your best interest?
It's very hard for me to answer that question based on today.
Exactly, and that's part of the issue. And yet we go back to that first statement. Even if, which this is in the Talmud, but even if in this drash we might be able to possibly wonder whether or not the conversion of Yitro was completely wholehearted and not at all somewhat of self-interest. Nevertheless, that very first statement of Rabbi Eliezer says, I welcomed him, you welcome him.
You mentioned before that he was living sort of outside.
Rashi did, yes.
All right. Well, then it seems to me that he was taking a stand, a conviction that he doesn't want to live like the rest of the people. He wanted to be different.
That he'd already made a statement of wanting to be separate, and now here along comes a nation and a way of living which exemplifies the opposite of what he had rejected. And so it'd be natural that he would want to attach himself to that.
Well, that's what Abraham did. He rejected the false gods before he had a revelation from Hashem. Of
the true God, exactly. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the emotional underpinning of all of this rancor around Yitro. So, Aaron, do you want to keep reading on the next page? Sure.
Zimri took Cosby.
Wait, who are Zimri and Cosby? Is this a comedy duo? Kind of, but so Zimri and Cosby is taken from the book of Numbers, as you see here, from Bamidbar, and this is during a period of enticement, of entrapment, right? Where some ladies from Moab and Midian are enticing the Israelite men, and they're getting up to no good together. Yes?
Yes.
We noticing something?
Pinchas got involved.
What's that?
Pinchas got involved.
Pinchas got involved. So Zimri is in the act with Cosby, or at least that's what happens, and Pinchas kills them both. So that is the example of how far you should go rather than to be with somebody that isn't Jewish. Make sense? That isn't part of the tribe. But let's see how they play this out as a little bit more dramatically than we get in the Torah.
Zimri took Cosby said to him, Ben Amram,
That's Moses' father's name. Son of Amram.
is this woman forbidden or permitted?
So what? Can I be with her or not?
And if you should rule that she is forbidden, as to the daughter of Yitro, who permitted you to marry her?
Ouch, I think we say. Ouch. So Zimri shows up and says, so, I got this babe here, and she and me, we're going to get together. But is that okay with you? And if that's not okay with you, then what are you doing with her? What are you doing with Zipporah? Who told you she was okay if you're going to tell me she's not okay? Eesh. And?
Moses forgot the law, and all of them broke out in tears, as it is written. And they were weeping before the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. As it is written, and Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw, said Rob. He saw the deed and then remembered the law. He said to him, O brother of the father of my father, have you not taught us as you came down from Mount Sinai? He who has sexual relations with an
Aramean. An Aramean is a stand-in for any non-Jewish woman.
Zealots beat him up on the spot. When it says, now I know.
Back.
Okay.
That's the next drash. Okay? So to understand how contentious this issue would be of who Moses is with, and therefore why they might be very much focused on her father, we just have to imagine this conflict between Zimri and Moses. And that, after all, we have to also explain why is it that Moses himself didn't stop Zimri? And the answer being given here? He was so stunned by the question, and perhaps so perplexed for himself about what the status really is, that he was unable to act. And so Pinchas had to step in, so to speak. Someone who wasn't quite so emotionally close to the incident, to the problem. Maybe?
Was Zimri marrying this woman, or just?
Well, he was doing something with her that married couples do.
But Moses was married to Zipporah.
Yes, but marriage to a non-Jew is non-binding under Jewish law. And so, at least according to Jewish law. So therefore, the continual acts of marital congress are still out of marriage, as far as Jewish law is concerned.
I gotta go back to the first comment this lady made.
Yeah.
Where's Zipporah in all this? Why aren't we talking, it's matrilineal descent, why aren't we talking about Zipporah and her step in any of these commentaries?
I mean, why aren't we talking about her mother?
Yeah.
It's a very good question, and one that actually goes into a much deeper discussion of how matrilineal descent became more and more prominently affixed in our minds as
Was that not the case at this time?
Patrilineal descent was extremely important. Let's make it as a short answer. It was a much more complicated system because the patrilineal line determined an awful lot in a person's life, even if the matrilineal line determined whether they were or not included within the status of the tribes of Israel. So having a clear picture of who her father was did make a big difference in their understanding of what her status would be, even though technically her Jewish identity wouldn't have been determined. Because remember, there's no way she could be Jewish when they met. But that doesn't mean that she wasn't an idolater. She could have been an idolater, she could have been one of these others, and that would have been more likely to be determined by how her family was living. And we got this big old red flag that says Cohen for Yitro. And so they need to figure out his status because that's where we get the red flag in order to make an implication about her status. So you're right, Zipporah should be the focus, but we don't have enough clues about her. So we're looking where we do have clues, which is her father.
You don't read anywhere, I've never read anywhere where Moses' sons ever had any status.
In terms of standing within the community or of being the high position?
No.
Correct.
The descendants later on are never mentioned.
Correct. Moses' authority, Moses' position and standing in the community does not become hereditary. That's very true. I don't necessarily know we can make that a knock against Zipporah, or whether we would make that more as a foresight by God to make sure that Moses' children didn't inherit his authority even if they were undeserving.
I wonder if you could argue Jewishly that because Moses didn't understand Judaism for his first 80 years, he didn't grow up Jewish, he knew nothing of Judaism, he did nothing wrong in marrying Zipporah. And so it wasn't until he came back to Egypt, learned more about Judaism, but he's already been married for 40 years.
Well, and that's a very good point. But if we look in the book of Ezra, when Ezra and the others come back from the land of Babylon, and the Israelites that had been left behind had begun taking non-Jewish wives, what does Ezra tell them to do? Once he explains the law to them of what they should. Get rid of your wives. Send them away.
But they were raised Jewish. They should have known
Well,
better.
they were and they weren't. I mean, the people who were left behind were not exactly the most well-versed in the traditions of our people. I mean, they took the scribes and the learned ones very deliberately to Babylon. So even though they would have known they were Jewish, they would not have had a good understanding of what that entailed in all circumstances. So it's a little bit, they would have known more perhaps than Moses would have known, but they still would have been somewhat innocent in terms of deliberately violating the norms of the people. But once it became clear to them by Ezra what they should be doing, they were ordered to get rid of those foreigners. So why didn't Moses divorce Zipporah?
She has one thing to her credit.
She has a lot of things to her credit.
She circumcised her sons.
Yes, she did indeed circumcise. The entire details of that episode are extremely difficult to untangle, but yes, she was certainly involved in that process and seems to be attached in that process to God and to our people, which is very true. All right, we're running out of time, so we're going to just buckle down, finish off a few more things, talk about current events, and then go have lunch. Okay, Mary.
When it says, "Now I know."
Remember, that was the phrase that Jethro greeted Moses with in our parasha, where he said, "Now I know that God is amazing and there's nothing else like God," which, as we said at the very beginning, seems to imply either that he does still believe there are other gods, but that they are merely inferior, or that until this moment he believed in other gods and now he's had a change of heart. Sadia Gaon has a different read.
It doesn't mean that before then Yitro didn't know God. If that were the case, it would have been forbidden for Moses to marry his offspring. Rather, it means he didn't know that God punishes the oppressor with the same measure with which he oppressed.
Midah keneged midah. That as someone does, so is it done to them. What was the most heinous act of the Egyptians to the Israelites, specifically their children?
Killing the firstborn.
And how was that done?
Killing the first.
Throwing them into the river. How were the Egyptians killed in last week's parasha? In the waters of the Sea of Reed. So what Sadia Gaon is saying, when Yitro says, "Now I know," it's not, "Now I know there is a God," or "Now I know that God is God." He's saying, "Now I know that not only is God God and the creator and master of all the universe, but God even goes so far to make his justice just that he will punish people in a way that fits very appropriately the transgressions that they committed." That's what I've learned, is saying Yitro. Not my discovery of God, my discovery of the depths to which God's justice extends, or the lengths to which God's justice extends. Sound good? Maybe?
Why is that important?
Why is that important?
Yeah.
Well, it's important because it's important to know more about God. But it's also important for Sadia Gaon to make sure that we don't misinterpret this verse as believing that Yitro didn't believe in God until this time. Because if so, as he said, Moses wouldn't have been able to marry his daughter. So Saadia Gaon sees a problem if we interpret this as being God is now being revealed to Yitro. So he has to say, no. He already knew God, but now that Saadia Gaon has claimed that, he has to come up with a explanation of the verse. Pretty thin? Well, it does match the wording pretty well. I mean, even in the JPS translation, if you look at verse 11, now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, yes, by the result of their very schemes against the people. This idea of, by their schemes, by their oppression, by their deeds, that kind of, sort of, does imply that he's seeing something about God's justice here. And what Saadia Gaon is transferring the emphasis from the now I know that God is greater than all the other gods as a general statement to the specific of now I know not only that God is God, but that God is so much better than all the other gods because even all those other fake gods never claimed to do justice this well. And look at how well God did. So it's not exactly a stretch, but he's creating a tension that needs to be resolved by making us believe that Yitro already believed in God when this verse began.
We all have to learn more about God.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Which is a very good activity. I highly recommend it. It's an excellent hobby. Absolutely.
And we aren't born knowing it.
And that's very true. And we're going to hit Rashi as well, who gives his own spin.
I acknowledged him in the past, but now even more so.
So, Rashi's also got to deal with this verse. And Rashi had already said that, Yitro had walked away from idolatry years ago. So now what's he doing that's different? He's saying even more. He's saying hooray for God even louder than before. Which, again, we have Psalms that have David expressing much the same. I thought that I was going to die, but God saved me. That doesn't mean he didn't believe in God before. It just means now that he has experienced God's deliverance, again and again and again for David's case, he believes even more about God. He knows even more. The depths of his affection for God has grown. Okay?
And he went away to his land to convert the members of his family.
So at the end of 1827, Yitro leaves, which is kind of a problem. Because where is he going? If he became one of us, shouldn't he stick around? But the Mechilta gives us an answer. Where's he going? He's on a mission to convert the members of his family, his nation. He's going to try and help more people come to God. Because Judaism is a proselytizing religion, right?
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
At that time.
Was, is, will be.
Abraham did.
Abraham did.
It depends upon which segment of Judaism we're talking about.
It depends on the different eras in Judaism, more specifically. Judaism has always been, in its core, just as our first quote said, way back when in Eliezer, that God reached out to people, we should reach out too. However, different historical circumstances have made Jews more or less favorably inclined to either welcome converts or to actively display the beauties of Judaism in a way that might attract potential converts. And that tension gets played out throughout Jewish law, and it's getting played out in our contemporary society as well, our contemporary times. The current attitude towards converts is, well, yeah, what is it?
Depends where you live.
Depends where you live. It depends who you ask. Jewish law is actually very clear that the requirements for somebody to convert, as far as the nuts and bolts of it, are very, very minimal. You got to be circumcised if you're a guy. You got to go into a mikveh no matter what, and you have to know some of Jewish law, which is what the Talmud actually says. You got to know some of the biggies and some of the small things and the punishments and the rewards. And if someone says, "Yep, sign me up," boom, we're done. The idea of 500 hours worth of study, which was a requirement in some programs, the idea of years of supervision and tutelage or mentorship, doesn't exist within classical thinking. But we've had a rough few centuries with the process of conversion. It's been illegal for a few thousand years, depending upon where we lived. Sentenced by death. You know, if you converted someone under the Catholic rule, the Catholic Church would come and give you a little bit of a problem for that. If you converted a Muslim to Judaism, most of our Jewish history under Muslim rule, the Muslims weren't terribly pleased about that either. So, and we had many people who would convert but would still maintain connections to their other families, and that might be used as a way of forcing the Jewish community to comply with edicts of non-Jewish governments. It's been a rough few thousand years for us and converts. But that doesn't change Jewish law.
Anybody who is my age or older and grew up as a conservative Jew will remember that when we were young, or I was young, you could not become a convert in the conservative movement if you were converting for the sake of marriage.
Mm-hmm.
This is no longer the case.
Correct.
For better or for worse, this is no longer the case. So,
well, it goes back to that wonderful phrase in our very first one of people who convert for the sake of heaven. And that has been interpreted in various ways. Just as you said, that you wouldn't necessarily discount Yitro's conversion if the only reason that he converted was because he was so impressed by what God did for us that he finally wanted to join. That wouldn't necessarily categorically say, well, that's not doing it for pure enough reasons. And similarly, depending upon different points of Jewish history,
this is what I was thinking.
We have seen, for marriage in particular, varying issues of whether it is or isn't. You know, for much of our history, you needed to be Jewish to be married, because if you weren't Jewish and you wanted to marry that person, then you both have to go be Catholic or both be Muslim. Because there was no such thing as a civil ceremony. You either were Jewish and got married to a Jew, or you were both Christian and got married under a priest. That's not the case now. People are quite happy, unfortunately, to get married without any religious ceremony whatsoever. Which means that conversion is no longer an impediment in the eyes of many to marriage.
Right.
In the eyes of many. Make sure that's very categorically clear, right? In the eyes of Judaism, Judaism has no authority to create a marital bond between a Jew and a non-Jew. Our laws don't extend to non-Jews. But in the eyes of many people in the modern society, you can get married at the courthouse just fine, and you can get married to anybody that you would like. Therefore, religion is no longer a barrier to marriage. Therefore, it is, in my opinion, highly suspect to say that converting for the sake of marriage is not for the sake of heaven. Because they could get married just fine down at the courthouse. If they're choosing to have a unified Jewish home, they are going above and beyond the minimum requirement for marriage. And therefore, that's not the only reason that the conversion is taking place. Which, if you've ever met somebody who, in quote, converted for the sake of marriage, you've probably noticed they treat their Judaism very seriously. And it wasn't just something that they did so they could have a chuppah. So you know what? You can have a chuppah even if you're not Jewish. Or to make the in-laws happy. Yeah, people don't care about making the in-laws happy much anymore anyways. It's very true. They move away. So what do they care if the in-laws are happy? And if the in-laws want to have Pesach and we'll go to their house for Pesach, sure. You know, it's not what it was. Which is why we're going to finish off with our last quote.
From all that has been stated and discussed, ruling follows that it is permissible and a mitzvah to accept male and female converts, even if it is known to us that they will not observe all the mitzvot, because in the end they will come to fulfill them. We are commanded to make this kind of opening for them, and if they do not fulfill the mitzvot, they will bear their own iniquities, and we are concerned.
So this is from Rabbi Uziel, who, as I said, was the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel back in the 40s and early 50s, and this was his opinion. Unfortunately, this is not the modern opinion of the Rabbanut in Israel, in my opinion, but I think it gives a very good summary of the lengths we should go through to not impede someone's conversion. Look at the hoops we went through textually to try and prove Yitro Jewish, with not really a whole lot of evidence that he was. if we're willing to strain ourselves to make Jethro Jewish even though he's dead, how much more should we be willing to strain ourselves to allow someone else to be Jewish who's still alive? Especially when we're not violating anything. And as Rabbi Uziel says, perhaps they will or won't keep all the mitzvot. We teach, we help, and if they choose not to after the fact, that's their choice and their burden to bear. But they'll never keep the commandments if we don't let them in the first place.
Was he talking about it through the eyes of the Holocaust and worrying about how few Jews there were and saying we've got to increase our numbers?
Not in the context where I read this quote, but I mean we can always speculate on the emotional motivation for why he might have ruled this way. This quote actually came just after the first quote. He quoted from the section of Mechilta where God is admonishing Moses to be welcoming to Yitro. And he says, just as God told Moses to be open to those who wish to come, we too should be open to those who wish to come and should not throw up unnecessary barriers. And unfortunately that has been a message that has been not well received. We have focused, and rightly so, on helping people that are intermarried to still have a Jewish life. But if we did a better job of making people realize they can be Jewish and don't need to merely be comfortable in the community, but can actually be a 100% equal member in every way, and that is a good thing, I think we would have gotten a lot further in helping to stem the tide of intermarriages. But unfortunately, we have a difficulty expressing what it is we believe is so wonderful about Judaism that we think someone else should want to be part of it, and then having expressed it, making it possible for them to be part of it. So we shoot ourselves in both feet, and then wonder why we don't dance. With that, take care, everyone. And well, we can end on the happy note that we can change it. We don't have to continue in that perpetual self-maiming practice. The only thing that's keeping us from allowing, hundreds of thousands of more people who wish to be Jewish is us. And quite frankly, demographically, it's the only thing that's going to save us. If we want to look out, into the 50 years, we're not going to convince young and non-ultra-Orthodox families to have 10 kids. That's just not happen. That's a non-starter. We can talk about having more kids, absolutely, but we're not going to get up to 10. We're not going to get up to even, I would say, 5 is pushing it for most families. And they're going to get sick and tired of us arguing about that. So if we want to bring more people to Judaism, if we don't have the birth canal, then we've got conversion. And there's nothing stopping us from doing it except us. Show people what's wonderful about Judaism, and then say, if you like this, talk to my rabbi. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.